Hey guys, let's take a minute to talk about the Sabbath. But this is not going to be the typical video that you might find in regards to the Sabbath. Those you can usually find on YouTube, and they come with a title that says 15 Reasons Why Jesus Did Away with the Sabbath, or 20 Reasons Why Christians Have to Keep the Sabbath, or 192 Reasons Why Jesus Nailed the Sabbath to the Cross. That's not really what this video is going to be about. I'm not going to throw a bunch of random verses at you, and I'm not going to try to convince anyone that the Sabbath is valid or invalid. Instead, what I'm going to do is point out a certain aspect of the Sabbath that no one else is really talking about. Now, I'm sure that I'm not the only person to ever see this, but for some reason, no one else is really talking about it. So have you ever wondered why Satan is going to be bound for a period of 1,000 years? This is found in Revelation chapter 20. Let's take a look at it. Starting in verse 1, "And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. And cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. And after that he must be loosed a little season." I remember reading this part years ago, and I could never really understand why 1,000 years. Why not 500 years or 60 years or 382 years? Why is it a period of 1,000 years? Well, believe it or not, this is directly tied to the Sabbath, and that's what I want to talk about. So what I want to do is I want to show you that there are different levels of fulfillment concerning the Sabbath. The first level would be days. God said, "For 6 days you are to work, and the seventh day you are to rest." This would be the first level of fulfillment. This is found in different places, but we're just going to look at it in Exodus chapter 20 where the commandments are given. So in verse 8 it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor the cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates." So this is the first level of fulfillment. We have a period of 7 days. 6 days you work, the seventh day you rest. The second level of fulfillment would be in years. This is what is commonly referred to as the Shemitah year. This is found in Leviticus chapter 25. Starting in verse 1, "And the Lord spoke unto Moses in Mount Sinai, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land which I give you, then shall the land keep a Sabbath rest unto the Lord. 6 years thou shalt sow the field, and 6 years thou shalt prune the vineyard, and gather in the fruit thereof. But in the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for the Lord. Thou shalt neither sow thy field, nor prune thy vineyard." So for 6 years, they were to plow, sow, and reap from the land. But in the seventh year, they were to let the land rest. This would be the Shemitah year, or a Sabbath year, or sabbatical year. So for 490 years, they did not keep this, and that's why they ended up in Babylon for 70 years. That is how many Sabbath years they owed. If you remember a few years back, there was talk about the Shemitah year. I think it was 2014 to 2015. And there were a lot of big-name ministers that were pushing it pretty hard. And the idea was that America was going to be judged because she was not keeping the Shemitah year. They were saying that the economy could collapse, or perhaps maybe some type of calamity was going to happen. But did anything happen? No, of course not. Well, why didn't anything happen? Well, the reason is found right here in verse 2. "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, When you come into the land." This commandment regarding the Sabbath year is specifically about those living in the land. How long were the Israelites in the wilderness? 40 years, right? Is there any record of them keeping the Sabbath year while they were in the wilderness? I am not aware of any. Am I supposed to believe that 2014 to 2015, assuming that's the correct Sabbath year, that God somehow cares about America keeping this Sabbath year, but 7 years before that and 14 years before that, there's no mention of it at all. Nobody says anything about it. And somehow God doesn't care, but now suddenly he does? If God cared about this, then why are the prophets not crying out about it every 7 years? You only really heard about it in 2014 to 2015. So clearly this is about being in the land. So this would be the second level of fulfillment concerning the Sabbath. We have a period of 6 years, and in the 7th year the land is to rest. So 6 days you work, 7th day you rest. 6 years you work the land, the 7th year you let the land rest. Now the third level of fulfillment, which I consider to be the ultimate fulfillment of the Sabbath, would be millennia. Now, a millennia is just a period of 1,000 years. It is said that from Adam to Abraham was 2,000 years. And then from Abraham to Yeshua was another 2,000 years. Now, we know roughly about 2,000 years ago was the period known as the first century when Yeshua showed up the first time. So we're approaching the end of another period of 2,000 years. That would be a total of 6,000 years, or 6 millennia. So for 6 millennia, man has had to work, labor, and deal with his enemies. But in the 7th millennia, also known as the age to come or the kingdom age, that is a millennia of rest. It is a Sabbath millennia. And this is why Satan is bound for 1,000 years. We can do a really quick search here for rest enemies. And there are a few places where God told them he was going to give them rest from their enemies. So for example, Deuteronomy 12:10. But when you go over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God gives you to inherit, and when he has given you rest from all your enemies round about. Again in Deuteronomy 25:19, the Lord thy God has given you rest from all your enemies round about. We see it again in Joshua 21:44, Joshua 23:1. We also see it down here in 2 Samuel. And it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies. So over and over again, we see this pattern of God telling them that he's going to give them rest from their enemies. Now, I know that there is nothing here that specifically refers to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is never mentioned here in any of these verses. But that doesn't mean that there is not a future fulfillment of God giving us rest from our enemies. Remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul talks about the commandment that says, do not muzzle the mouth of the ox as it treads out the corn. Or was that given for our benefit? And then he goes on to say, that was for our benefit. So clearly, Paul saw that yes, there is a commandment that says not to do that regarding the oxen, but there was also a deeper meaning and fulfillment behind it. So just as God told them in ancient times that he was going to give them a rest from their enemies, there is also a future fulfillment of this still waiting for us. And that future fulfillment would be the ultimate fulfillment of the Sabbath, which is the Sabbath millennia of rest, where we get a rest from our enemies, or more specifically, our enemy, which is Satan. If we go back to Revelation chapter 20, it says here in verse 3, it says, and cast him into the bottomless pit and shut him up and set a seal upon him that he should deceive the nations no more till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. What exactly is being fulfilled in this period of 1,000 years? It is the Sabbath rest that is being fulfilled. This would be the third level and ultimate fulfillment of the Sabbath. So let's take everything we just went over, and now let's apply this to the idea that Jesus did away with the Sabbath. So if Yeshua did away with the Sabbath and he nailed it to the cross, and it is gone and done away with, it is no more for us, it has no ties to us at all, it is no longer binding on us in any way, then how can any of us expect to enter into that future Sabbath rest if Jesus did away with the Sabbath? If the Sabbath ended at the cross, then the future fulfillment of the Sabbath also ended at the cross. Why would Yeshua bring the Sabbath to an end before anyone could ever see its ultimate fulfillment? Now you know that Yeshua would have known about this millennia of rest. After all, it's called the kingdom age or the age to come, and that's when his kingdom will be set up. So you know that he would have known about it. So why would Yeshua show up and say, hey guys, guess what? I'm bringing the Sabbath to an end. It's done away with. I'm going to nail it to the cross. Why would he do that before it could be ultimately fulfilled? If you believe that Jesus did away with the Sabbath, and it's no longer for us, then how can you expect to enter into that future Sabbath rest? You don't even believe that the Sabbath is valid anymore, but you believe that the future Sabbath millennia will be valid? That's not how that works. Either Jesus did away with the Sabbath or he didn't. If Jesus did away with the Sabbath, then he did away with the future fulfillment of the Sabbath. If the Sabbath ended at the cross, then the future fulfillment, that millennial rest, also ended at the cross. If the Sabbath is no longer for you, then that future Sabbath millennial rest is no longer for you. If there is no longer a Sabbath, because Yeshua came and did away with it, then how can anyone expect to enter into that future rest that has been promised to us? It is directly tied to the Sabbath. It is the seventh millennia, symbolic of the Sabbath day. The very Sabbath day that people say that Jesus did away with. Do you remember in 2 Peter chapter 3, it talks about a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day? Let's look at that real quick. This here is in verse 8. It says, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. So 6 days we are to work, the seventh day we are to rest. For 6 millennia we have had to work, but the seventh millennia is a millennia of rest." Why is no one else talking about this? These are the type of questions that we should be asking, but for some reason no one is asking them. Instead, we say things like, Jesus did away with the Sabbath, not even realizing that saying something like that implies that the Sabbath rest that we're all hoping to get into in the future has also been done away with. If Jesus did away with the Sabbath, then no one will be entering into that kingdom age to get that 1,000 years of rest. That's a pretty dangerous statement to make. Again, I'm not trying to convince anyone that the Sabbath is valid or invalid. I'm just asking questions that we should be asking, but for some reason no one's asking them. So those are my thoughts on this aspect of the Sabbath. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to comment below, and thank you for watching.